So, we've all seen the Season 3 trailer by now. Pretty cool, right? But if you then made the mistake to look at Twitter, you'll see...
Whoa, calm down, Jamal. Don't pull out the 9.
You don't fuck with no Cardi, no Uzi, no nothing?
Fucking hell, people had a lot to say. Jesus Christ. While I do somewhat agree with some of these takes, I am not here to say that the designs are bad per se. I want to take this as a chance to put into video format what I feel, and probably a lot of other players feel, are legit grievances with this game. And I do think this outrage is more symptom of multiple actually fair critiques rather than sole dissatisfaction with the designs. It kind of just exploded over it. And that's what I'll go over today. Although I'll be giving my own personal opinion and criticisms about things, my goal here isn't to start a tribal war of any sorts. Even though I just know there will be in the comments no matter what I do, we are going to start a dialogue about the shift of Zenless Zone Zero's direction and identity, and why I personally think that Zenless Zone Zero isn't becoming back, quote unquote, but it's losing some of its uniqueness. What initially drove a lot of people to this game, not only visually but also structurally. So let's start from the very beginning. What was Hoyoverse's pitch of this game to its already wide player base thanks to Genshin and Honkai? What was Zenless Zone Zero's appeal? This baseline should have an age restriction the way it touched me in all the right places. Good lord.
What?
The way ZZZ presented itself was iconic. It was so different from anything Hoyoverse or just gacha that I can't name off the top of my head. It was a different style, but not one that was entirely unfamiliar to most. This wasn't some niche aesthetic that ZZZ came up with. It's rooted in real influences that dominated pop culture at one point. Urban fashion that emerged in the 80s that were a mix of many subcultures from hip-hop to skate to even punk, and stayed popular throughout the 90s. We can see this even echo into media from the early 2000s with things like Jet Set Radio and The World Ends With You on the gaming side of things, even Splatoon when you really think about it. This is ball knowledge, but let me know if y'all know about street football. For a lot of people, this was the definition of cool when we grew up. And as such, there was so much conversation for people even outside of the gacha sphere wanting to check this game out simply because of how cool it looked. That and Nicole's massive tits. And I do think the game absolutely delivered at first. The proxies owning a VHS tape store, running through old railways, construction sites, abandoned buildings, fighting monsters and eldritch horrors with an OST that was the best mix of EDM, trap, and hip-hop, and it was exactly what you'd expect out of an urban fantasy game. And let's get this immediately out of the way since I've seen this said in a lot of comment sections recently. Urban fantasy isn't just fantasy that happens to take place in a city. Urban fantasy is a genre that works when there are both a grounding urban factor as well as the fantastical elements layered on top of it. And in my opinion, the best ones are really good at balancing the two. And this doesn't mean that the story has to necessarily be realistic in any sense of the word, but that the characters involved should have an internal logic within not only the story but the world itself that makes sense. For this, I always love the concept of ZZZ having proper character factions, because not only it gives you a team of characters that have synergy and look good together, but also easy setup and reasoning as to why this group of people is even in the game to begin with. Our first faction, the Cunning Hares, which their company's actual name is Gentle House, and I had completely forgotten about that fact somehow, is an odd jobs company that focuses on hollow commissions. What does this translate into with the characters we know? Four dumbasses just trying to make it till the end of the month with hollow commissions. And it makes sense that they rely on a proxy, us, for their work, as well as it makes sense for them to be able to fight in these damn hollows. It all follows a logic that says these characters exist in the world rather than simply for the sake of the story. And the list goes on. NEPs, they're all police. Section 6 being for special operations within the hollows, Sons of Caledon being one of the ruling forces on the outskirts of New Eridu for those who aren't able to lead a life in New Eridu itself, Mockingbird, whose motivation is being a Robin Hood-esque organization in what seems to be functionally a corporate oligarchical society. You just read their descriptions and you are immediately able to believe that they would exist in a setting like this. And again, it's not about being realistic, but it's about being consistent within your own world. That is, even while moving into more fantasy directions. Like with the shift from the end of Season 1 to the beginning of Season 2. After we defeated the sacrificed version of Bringer, it only made sense that we had to eventually look into how that even happened to begin with. And so we're thrusted into a new area that is still just as urban. I don't know why some people say it isn't, but it is. Phalium Heights looks awesome. And Sweetie is there, so that's an obvious plus.
I would fuck the Shanghai Sharks out that Chinese lady, man. She's so fucking hot.
And one thing that ZZZ loves doing is referencing movies. So making it into this classic kung fu movie thing where we learn about the way of the mystics of Yunquei Summit was different, but not out of place for ZZZ if you ask me. But I do think some differences became apparent in how ZZZ approached the creation of characters from here on out. In my opinion, many characters began to feel less like people who naturally existed within this setting and more like characters specifically created to fulfill a role within a particular story arc. Here, I'm not criticizing the execution of the stories themselves, which I find all very fun, well written, and enjoyable. What I'm trying to point out is a broader shift in how ZZZ has approached characters and their place in the world. From what I've been able to observe, characters from 2.1 and onwards feel a lot more like they were created to fill a specific role in the story rather than naturally existing within the world. Let's look at Alice and Yuzu, two characters with stories tied to each other due to Alice's father sacrificing his life to save Yuzu as his child. It's an incredibly dramatic narrative with great payoff, but once that story arc concludes, it starts to feel like their primary reason for existing was just to serve the Exaltus narrative, not necessarily to exist as people with an ongoing role within the world itself. And I think there's a lot of characters that share this problem in Season 2. This will be controversial, but it's time to air this bitch out. First off, Spook Shack in its entirety is the greatest offender, not because the characters are bad individually, but because the faction itself feels structurally weaker than earlier ZZZ factions, which usually share a profession or a goal, were brought together by the world around them, and most importantly had a clear role. Spook Shack, by comparison, feels much more like a collection of characters grouped together for narrative ease of use. Would it have changed much to the story if Yidhari wasn't part of Spook Shack? I personally don't think so. Even Oboe Squad, which conceptually makes sense in the world of ZZZ, has bits and pieces of this. Orphe, who, even while being part of my favorite moment in ZZZ at the end of 2.2, feels like she was heavily constructed around the needs of that specific storyline. Almost like a narrative device designed to elevate Isolde's narrative than someone who feels deeply embedded into the wider world of ZZZ, which again doesn't mean that the story is bad when you actually get down to it, but it keeps moving away from what identity ZZZ had set for itself of charming characters that are functional within the world itself and we cross paths with for a variety of reasons. And people, I think, definitely can feel that shift even if they aren't able to properly call it out. And ultimately, I think that's the trade-off Season 2 has made in some places. The story themselves become larger, more cinematic, but in exchange, the characters sometimes feel less like people existing within the world and more like protagonists designed for that storyline. And for me, that shift is where ZZZ starts feeling different from the game people originally fell in love with. A game where originally all characters were believable in their presence in the world even if they didn't all get the cinematic treatment. And this brings us to Season 3, which I can't discuss the story of since it's not out, but there's something still to be said in regards to the visual shift in particular. I like that someone brought up the main visuals for Season 1 and Season 3 because it goes to show how all those influences that originally made the game appealing to a lot of people stylistically are completely gone. There's no other way to put it, and it doesn't mean that one is worse than another, that's completely preference. But it's clear that we're not looking at the same thing. It's even hard to call it an evolution of sorts because of how far removed the two are from each other. If I had to say, Season 3 leans heavily into a more high fantasy adjacent aesthetic with a lack of intelligent constructs, a lack of tyrants that look more like Pulchra than Seth, character designs that wouldn't look out of place in another fantasy gacha game like Star Savior, which again isn't inherently bad in a vacuum, but it does mean ZZZ slowly loses some of the distinct visual language that originally made it stand out for what feels like an attempt at broadening the target audience. But that's of course just speculation on my part on why they changed so drastically. I don't work at Hoyo, I don't know for sure. And in my opinion, as well as the opinion of Twitter crybabies apparently, it seems to be having the opposite effect with some players. Because as I said earlier, ZZZ's original appeal was never niche to begin with. Its entire identity was built on visual influences that dominated pop culture for years. Things a huge amount of people already associated with being cool as fuck. So when that identity starts shifting towards something totally different, it's bound to create friction with the people who came to the game specifically because it wasn't trying to look like everything else. It's kind of like when enthusiast phone companies try too hard to become mainstream. I'm looking at you, OnePlus. Sure, there's obvious business value in making a product appeal to a wider audience, but the people who originally supported you often did so because you weren't mainstream in the first place. Not to say that ZZZ wasn't a mainstream gacha game, but it had a most definitely uniqueness that set it apart from others. And all of this to say that ZZZ had an undeniably very strong and structural identity early on. The world felt cohesive, with factions and characters that clearly embedded into it in a way that made sense within the setting. In Season 2, you can already start to see some of that cohesion loosen for the sake of heightened drama and more cinematic moments with the characters that were released. And because of that, some characters begin to feel less like they naturally exist within the world and more like they're positioned around specific narrative arcs. Not in the sense that they're poorly written, but in the sense that their role in the story becomes the only thing that defines them rather than working in tandem with their identity and role within the world prior to it. And by Season 3, the visual direction seems to have shifted enough that it creates a noticeable rift in how the game currently presents itself compared to its original identity people were attracted to. And when you put all of this together, I simply don't think it's accurate to frame the reaction as entirely unprompted. Sure, Twitter crying isn't productive in the slightest, but framing every single critique as simply tourist, entities, bad actors, Season 1 Puritans, or whatever the fuck other buzzword you want to come up with isn't either. I'd like to think I did an alright job presenting all these critiques I had, but you guys let me know. Do you agree with my points? Did I miss something? Have you felt the shift that I've been trying to relate to you in the past 10 minutes? Let me know all of that in the comments down below. I've been Tomoyou. Like, comment, and subscribe to all the YouTube stuff you guys already know. And I'll see you in the next one. Mwah!